make is to describe what I would see as a regrettable tendency of the English Parliament of handing over controversial decisions regarding reproduction to clinicians rather than trusting women, or in certain circumstances, couples to make those decisions for themselves. If you look back to the late 1960s and the debates which preceded the introduction of the Abortion Act, you will see that they are debates which are predicated on a series of assumptions about the kind of woman who would seek to terminate a pregnancy. So we have desperate multi-child mothers with alcoholic husbands who are incapable of raising a child. We have selfish, immature, promiscuous teenagers who are incapable of raising a child. And in that context, and with that set of values, it's probably not surprising that Parliament took the decision to hand over the abortion decision to high-minded, responsible clinicians rather than to women. Now, as many of you will know, in practice, this has led to a very liberal access to abortion in this country. So you might be tempted to say, well, you know, why are you talking about this? Does it matter? And that fits very neatly into a long and ignoble tradition in English law of giving decisions to someone else because women aren't capable of making them for ourselves. If you have a piece of legislation that says this decision belongs to clinicians, then clearly that offers scope for clinicians who aren't sympathetic to termination to place hurdles in the path of women who are looking for abortions. Clearly clinicians have a very significant role. What I don't think they should be doing is conflating moral and medical decision making and making moral personal decisions for women. And we should be highly sceptical of the disingenuity of Parliament telling us that something is a medical matter, when really we can see it's one in which all these moral and social issues are highly implicated. I think the decision of whether to carry a pregnancy on or whether to bring a child into the world is a deeply, deeply morally serious decision. Where I differ from some people in this debate, however, is that I believe that women are capable of making morally significant decisions.
I'm going to address interference on how women should reproduce using assisted reproduction. Now, I think it's very important to understand why we have legislation in this country. We started our decisions about regulation in 1990, and the kind of reasons that we went into it is really the precautionary principle. It was not the fact that there were high-minded doctors making the decisions, but very much the opposite, that there was fear and mistrust of what doctors and scientists will get up to. Fear of where it will all lead. Is it going to be safe? Now, as a result of the 1990 legislation, we have got draconian confidentiality, no altering the genetic material of the egg or the embryo, do nothing to an embryo in the name of research without a license, and with all of this is wrapped up in a new quango called the HFEA. So that's the base on which we make all our decisions currently. Now, there are other parts of regulation in assisted reproduction that is not within statute. And the one that I want to deal with is the number of embryos to be put back at embryo transfer after IVF. And you may ask, as I have written here, but surely women can decide for themselves and deal with their consequences themselves. And I think the one big thing that does make it different is there is another party. And the other party, and whenever the woman makes a decision, it has a direct impact on somebody else, and that is the child, i.e. the adult who will be born and grow up. For example, if a decision the woman made would result in triplets, it'll have enormous implications, not only for that child, especially if it's born prematurely, but for the health service that you and I pay for. It was only when the HFEA acted that we managed to reduce the triplet pregnancy rate. So both the clinicians and the women themselves were in the position to make that decision, but didn't. And it has made a big difference, but look what is happening here. There has been absolutely no impact on the fact that twin pregnancy has become an epidemic, and those children are being damaged in exactly the same way. So the evidence shows quite clearly that single embryo transfer in selected patients ought to be the way to go. Now, the HFEA have not put in a policy that now says you will have one embryo. They've been very, very sensible. They've now looked at output, and it says clinics will decide with their patients, the couples, how they are going to reduce multiple pregnancy. So if the woman thinks that they might be infertile, they are taking a chance not for themselves, they're taking a chance for the next generation. And I think if we can see, as clinicians, scientists and the public, that that could be damaging, we have a moral responsibility to prevent that happening.
I would really depart from the direction that you're going in this. John Stuart Mill said it was better for an individual to encompass his own destruction than the evil of allowing others to constrain him for what they decide to be his own good. That's a view that I think cuts very much to the heart of what I think about the decisions that people should be in a position to make regarding their reproductive future. You know, there are people who have often said to me in debates, when it comes to abortion, don't women make the wrong decisions? How can we stop people from making the wrong decisions? What about the woman who comes to you and she wants an abortion this year because she wants to go on holiday, but she's going to want to come and get pregnant again the following year? Can you say that she's making the right decision? And in lots of ways, I suppose, I always feel that it's not for me to say whether or not I think that the decision that she's making is right for her. It really has to be for her to make the decision, because ultimately she is the person who will live with that decision every day of her life from then on. It is because I've got a very firm belief that people should take responsibility for the decisions that they make, that I think that we need to be respectful of decisions that people make, even when we think that their decision is wrong. I'm very personally hostile to legislation and regulation that says that people are not in a position to make the wrong choices. And I think it does come down at the end to who do we trust, and whether people can be responsible for making complex decisions for themselves. And I think that when clinicians really did begin to be compelled to discuss with their patients that they might not get a better outcome with IVF if they had more embryos, then actually you did get people voluntarily making a choice that you would approve of, because they understood that that was what was going to give them the best results. And I know that what I would want if I was undergoing infertility treatment would be to be saying to a doctor, what is the best way of giving me my best chance of having a successful, healthy pregnancy, and going along with that? And you may say, well, it's 3 embryos or 1 embryo or whatever, but I would want it to be a rational choice that's dictated by my personal needs as somebody seeking treatment and your personal advice as a treatment doctor, and not by some bishop sitting on the HFEA, or a journalist here, or an elected parliamentarian, dare I say, who is saying to me, you know, no, I think it's the wrong thing for you to do. I think when it comes to these matters of family life and procreation, it really should be down to the parents and ultimately the woman who will be carrying the pregnancy to make that decision, with a caveat being that when we come to abortion, as you talked about, and when we talk about infertility treatment, there is also another individual who's involved with it, and that's the doctor who's going to be carrying out the procedure, because I also feel that there is no way that a doctor should be compelled to carry out treatments that they think are immoral or incompatible with what they feel that their knowledge is. What I hope will happen is that you can have a situation where you can have patients and clinicians who are coming to a decision about the best possible option for themselves, and that regulation is confined to really keeping the bad side out of it, where it doesn't impinge on that degree of autonomy.
There is a fundamental difference between abortion and the kind of assisted reproduction I'm talking about. And I agree with you that women who make those decisions live with those decisions for the rest of their lives. So many women we see struggling to get pregnant who've had 2 or 3 abortions in the past. But that was right for them at the time, or they believed it was right, and they have to be supported with that. The punishment or the difficulty or whatever they may feel it is later comes back when they are then trying to get pregnant and have difficulty, and that's something else that they personally have to deal with. When they make that decision because of their needs to reproduce in some way, that has a major effect on 2 other parts of society. One is the child themselves and the rest of their life, and the second thing is on all of you who are going to pay for it. They don't ask you, are you prepared to pay $1 million for my premature baby, or £1 million? They make that decision, and I'm sad to say it, but it is a selfish decision because it's about fulfilling their personal need. And I think there is an obligation to turn around and try and deal with it. And I think the right way is by education, because I do think that women will make that correct decision, provided they're given the right information and mammon doesn't come in and try and get them to make the wrong decision to improve clinic success rates.
What about sex selection for non-medical reasons? Currently illegal in the UK. Why shouldn't parents be allowed to make that choice?
You can either look at this from a woman's point of view, and many women that I've come across are violently against the idea that sex selection should be done, and usually because of, when we look at how it is being done internationally, it is usually to select for men, and it is usually showing a pejorative difference between men and women. Now, that aside, there would have been another way to deal with this, and that would simply have been to say, for the next 2 years, we are going to allow anybody who wants to have sex selection to have sex selection, and at the end of those 2 years, we will look at this. And if it shows no difference between males and females, there is no reason why we should ban it, other than the fact that there is straight away a pre-decision made by the couple as to what they think a boy or a girl should be when they get brought up. And that is another issue entirely. Now, the HFEA and the government do not have the wit to take that one on, and we've lived with what we're doing. Other places talk about family balancing and so on. I can't see it's a difficult decision. I think there are both sides to it. I'm pretty neutral on it.
Why would we assume that clinicians are better placed to judge what's in the welfare or the best interest of a future child than are women themselves? And in the sex selection context, I think actually maybe that becomes even more clear. I mean, it doesn't seem to me that there are any good, ethically justified, fully grounded reasons for telling people that they can't choose the sex of their child.
What I do have a problem with is the increasing pressure that's coming on the HFEA at the moment to be utterly prescriptive. Think on the welfare thing. You know, an idea that I've held for a very long time is that the thing that most impacts on the welfare of newborn babies is actually poverty. And we don't say that poor people cannot have children yet. But there is that sort of strong sense that once you go down the risk of saying, well, the welfare of the child is paramount, then how do you actually define that? And where do you cut it off? And when do you say, well, this person's life circumstances are not good enough because they will be damaged in a particular way?
If it is the case that it's a bad idea to have 3 embryos implanted, then medics are quite legitimately can argue that and make that point. Now, if you go to your doctor with back pain and he recommends back surgery without doing a proper investigation, he's recommending something that's really bad, and we would say don't do that. Even if the patient asks for it, you don't give it to them, because that would be bad medical practice. So if it's bad medical practice to implant 3 embryos, then surely you can win the argument on that basis, rather than all this fluff about money and morals and all the rest of it. It's a medical decision.
I think we're living in a very prescriptive society. What increasingly is beginning to happen is an undermining of any of our individual right to choose.
And I heard you mention the phrase, it's a decision for a woman that affects the rest of her life. And I really worry about that as an argument for autonomy and choice. There's so much counseling involved in sexual decisions for women, morning after pill, abortion, fertility, and it really undermines the resilience of humans, the resilience of women, the fact that we can overcome a lot of situations, whether we choose to have a child or choose to abort. And I just think that it's really creating this image of frailty, that we need so much assistance. And then just one question is basically, can you have a child or choose to not have a child without morality even playing a role in it?
It is possible for many women to take decisions about abortion that don't weigh particularly heavily on their conscience. I think that for some women it is a completely straightforward thing, and it is something that they just can move on from. And I do agree with you that there is a real problem in undermining the resilience of women to do that. When I said, though, that I thought that women should be charged with responsibility for the decision because they live with the effect of that decision, what I simply meant was that you are practically faced with either you have a child or you don't. That's going to be the effect of that decision, and it's a very stark reality. And the reason why I present it in that way is because I do think that it's possible for Peter the doctor, Evan the politician, I don't know, so-and-so the counsellor, to go home from their day job and walk away from it. Whereas for the woman who you've made the decision in relation to, she lives with it.
In the 1990 Act, There was the decision that you could only have IVF if you were married. And it was won by one vote, if I remember. And part of the SOP was to say, okay, you can do it if you're not married, if you consider the welfare of the child. And that meant that, God, if they're not married, then that's not good for the child. And therefore we can put that in legislation. It wasn't from this very, I believe, appropriate way that every clinician, and I hope every parent thinks. And that is they're doing something where you have to consider the third party. No clinician is happy that it is enshrined in legislation. It is something that you ought to be doing automatically. It doesn't have a checklist next to it. But if you see a couple and you're really worried about, if they've got 3 children here and 7 children there and 2 that died in suspicious circumstances, and they say, I'd like IVF, what kind of a person are you to say, this doesn't sound right, what's going on here?
I think it's wrong for a patient's interest to be trumped by a non-existent person, okay? We don't do that in any other sphere of medicine. And if you say, well, they might well exist, there's an argument that if you refuse treatment, then you're making that person never exist. And it's probably better to be born into terrible circumstances or more difficult circumstances like poverty, as Anne said, than not to exist at all, if you're going to make that argument. It's clearly wrong, in my view, to say your parents are drug addicts or even worse, old or something, because we have a social services system. Finally, what upsets me is the fact that it should be Parliament that decides, and I should be over what happened when we had a cross-party series of amendments that would have modernised the abortion law, and I would have been happy to have been defeated in Parliament by the Pope by proxy or whoever. But what happened was that the government, the executive, told Parliament it wasn't allowed to debate this when it hasn't been debated since 1990, 1967. That's unacceptable in a democracy.
There was one thing that you said that really struck me, and it was the fact that you think you can even put a price on a child's life, the fact that the £1 million or $1 million is even significant. I'm not a taxpayer, I'm 16, but if I was, I would never have a problem paying money to help save someone's life. The issue would be more spending it to help kill people in wars or things like that. It should never be a case of how much money. If you're going to argue on the medical point of view, like someone said over here, that's one thing. But the thing you said is that the fourth person and saying that us taxpayers should have a say in something like that, and I think that's totally wrong, and you should never argue in that point.
Okay. It's not about the fact that we are all paying for it, although we do, and that baby wasn't being salvaged for that reason. It was the fact that it cost so much for that child meant that child's future health care was going to be compromised. So it's not about that. Some clinicians need to be able to say, no, I will not do this because it is medically unsound to do it, and therefore I won't do it. If you want to go to somebody else who wants to be less sound, that is fine. And I think we also have a role in this equation.
When we make decisions about having children, we don't do it simply by looking at our biological clock ticking away. Usually, the right bloke being somewhere in the picture is the biggest thing that drives us on this. But sorry, girls, absolute fact of life, if you meet the right bloke and you're 40, it's really hard. If you meet the right bloke and you're 19, it's really easy. And in fact, one of the things that becomes quite frustrating and I think deeply hypocritical in the policy side of it is that if you actually looked at the optimum age for childbearing, teenage pregnancy would not be a problem. It would just be recommended, because biologically that's when you're really hot to trot in terms of having children, and it's just a kind of fact of life, and that's what we have to get over. And so I think the core point about it is not to blame doctors for laying the stats out on it, is actually to say that it's not simply age and fertility that's an issue when you're making your decisions about having children, it's the whole rest of life. And the wonderful thing about infertility treatment is that it does allow us to extend those years. I started off with the point that, I thought that tolerance is the price that we have to pay for our adventure in liberty. And I think maybe the tolerance of some, the personal views of some doctors may also be something that we have to take into consideration, as well as our tolerance of the attitudes of rogue patients. Thank you.
Okay, can we thank the panel?